Greetings. Welcome to Dr. English's Book Lovers Book Club. I'm Dr. English. I teach English. This week, following the dystopian novels I read, I'm going to do a post-apocalyptic book called On the Beach. I put a picture of this on social media, and one of my colleagues, professors, said, that's a very glum book, and I thought, that's a really good way to describe it. This is a glum book. It is not for the faint of heart because it's just very technical and it's very 1950s. I think it was published in 1950 something. Let me look. 57. So there's a lot of like what I would consider sexist language and not really misogynist, but very sexist language of just the relationship between the lieutenant commander, uh, uh, Dwight Towers, and Peter Holmes is the same way. It's just like, it's a shocking book if you are a young person. It would be really hard to read this book. I'm just going to say that because the language in it is so archaic and outdated. They call the women in their lives honey, and Peter Holmes keeps referring to his own daughter as an it all the way throughout. It was just like, it's jarring after I haven't read this. I read this in high school. I was 16 years old, and I told my friend, the professor, I'm like, what possessed a 16-year-old to read On the Beach and Wuthering Heights, which is a very dark book, and My Antonia, which is also a very dark book. I'm not sure what possessed me to read this because it's really glum. Obviously, it's post-apocalyptic. You know, it's a story about American lieutenant commander in the Navy whose ship is in Australia, and there's been a nuclear war, and the nuclear fallout is slowly drifting southward. And so most of the book is very technical, like a lot of Navy, kind of commentary of taking out a submarine, and they're going on these different trips to see what they can see in other parts of the world, holding out the hope that there's still some people alive in the northern hemisphere. And so it's a combination of that. Commander Towers, stays true to his calling as a Navyman. He follows all the protocol, even with, the way the world is, he still follows every kind of protocol he's supposed to follow. And I think if one thing this book is about, like staying true to what your calling is and what your command is. And I find that fascinating. That he, doesn't break the rules. That, they say, well, we can have a drink on your ship. And he says, no, we don't have drinks on our American ships, And so Peter Holmes is the Australian, like, okay. And there's a lot of drinking. And I'm thinking, well, they know that this radioactive cloud is coming. So, but for the most part, you find that people just go on living their lives, in this book. Peter Holmes's wife, Mary, in particular, is just like, she is not coming to terms with the reality, because they have a little girl named Jennifer, and not an it. Like, I still find it really fascinating that he calls his own child it. It wouldn't stop crying, and I'm like, what the heck? And I'm like, I don't know if men at that time, I don't know if Nevil Shute had children, and if he did, he just considered them its. So it's a little bit, like I said, for 2026, it's a little disturbing to read that and think, wow. Plus, also, they call the women honey, and Myra, she goes back to school to become a secretary and learn shorthand. So a lot of that stuff is like, it's outdated for so many. Most people, young people, don't know what shorthand is. And so in that regard, it's a little outdated. However, I will say, I think there are people in the world now who this would benefit if it was a little bit updated. People would benefit from what the reality is of what happens in a nuclear war, like the annihilation of all living things. It's just, and I'm not saying, it's just like, I've been watching this show Paradise, and there's a guy saying, like, there was a massive eruption, and somebody keeps asking this scientist about it. He says, I don't know, ask a dinosaur. And I think that's kind of, it's interesting to me. There are a lot of shows right now that are about post-apocalyptic, and I thought none of them are quite like this, because we have, all this time from 1957 to see how our modern world is compared to what it was in 1957. But the reality of it, they talk about Geiger counters, they talk about the levels of radiation. And so I find that really fascinating, that, and just the reality of it, that most people would probably be the same way, that they would continue just going on, and, until they knew that radiation was going to reach far enough south. And so just as an example, this is toward the end of the book, but it's not giving away too much, but then you kind of know right at the beginning what's going to happen. But, it's a story to be told about how people deal with, the impending end of the world. And I find it really fascinating. Tuesday night was a disturbed night for the Holmeses. The baby began crying at about 2 in the morning, and it cried almost incessantly till dawn. There was a little sleep for the young father or mother. At about 7 o'clock, it vomited. And this is what I'm going about. I'm saying it is the child, Jennifer. Outside, it was raining and cold. They faced each other in the gray light, weary and unwell themselves. Mary said, "Peter, you don't think this is it, do you?" "I don't know," he replied, "but I should think it might be. Everybody seems to be getting it." She passed a hand across her brow wearily. "I thought we'd be all right out here in the country." He did not know what he could say to comfort her, and so he said, "If I put the kettle on, would you like a cup of tea?" She crossed to the cot again and looked down at the baby. She was quiet for the moment. He said again, "What about a cup of tea?" It would be good for him, she thought. He had been up for most of the night. She forced a smile. That'd be lovely. He went through to the kitchen to put the kettle on. She was feeling terrible, and now she wanted to be sick. It was being up all night, of course, and the worry over Jennifer. Peter was busy in the kitchen. She could go quietly to the bathroom without him knowing. She was often sick, but this time he might think it was something else and get worried. In the kitchen, there was a stale smell, or it seemed to be. Peter Holmes filled the kettle at the tap and plugged it in. He switched on and saw, with some relief, the indicator light come on that showed the current was flowing. One of these days, the juice would fail, and then they would be in real trouble. The kitchen was intolerably stuffy. He threw open the window. He was hot and then suddenly cold again, and then he knew he was going to be sick. He went quietly to the bathroom, but the door was locked. Mary must be in there. No point in alarming her. He went out to the back in the out of the back door in the rain and vomited in a secluded corner behind the garage. He stayed there for some time. When he came back, he was white and shaken, but feeling more normal. The kettle was boiling, and he made the tea and put 2 cups on a tray, took it to their bedroom. Mary was there, bending over the cot. He said, "I've got the tea." She did not turn, afraid her face might betray her. She said, "Oh, thanks. Pour it out. I'll be there in a minute." She did not feel that she could touch a cup of tea, but it would do him good. He poured out the 2 cups and sat on the edge of the bed, sipping his. The hot liquid seemed to calm his stomach. He said presently, "Come on and have your tea, dear. It's getting cold." So that is pretty much like throughout just the ordinary everyday things that people would do. And I find that would probably be true all over the whole globe, that people would just accept what was going to happen and just try to have a normal life. The one thing that's not quite normal is Myra and Anthony Towers, or I mean, Dwight Towers is the American, and he's married and has 2 children, and it's just really poignant, that relationship, and you can tell the time period because they don't have any kind of sexual relation, which I just, the way that Nevil Shute handles that, the dignity of Myra, who's never had a friend, and Dwight, staying true to his wife and his 2 children in Connecticut, even though they're, he knows what the reality is. He still goes on as if they are there, and I find that really poignant. And so, as far as this book and teaching it, I think it would be really tough to teach this in high school or middle school. Even though I read it when I was 16, but I think teaching it would be tough because you definitely have to have a conversation about the language and the way that people spoke to each other in the late 1950s and early 60s. So it's like a timepiece too. So you'd have to, not unlike other books like To Kill a Mockingbird, you still have to talk about like that. People really said that back then. And so that's the other thing, it would be fun for maybe teenagers to say, wow, I can't believe people actually talk like that back then. And so you'd have to have that kind of conversation, but it's also maybe a book for the time that we do need to be thinking about. Like people were really, we had like, nuclear bomb kinds of drills back in the early 60s. I remember them from, when I was in elementary school and even middle school. So I think it would be, something that you could really, it's a great historical piece that you could really have a conversation with your students. But getting them to get through it would be a real challenge, I think, because it's just very dry and glum, as my professor friend said. So I would, really think about that as far as teaching it. Definitely, I think you can have it as a supplemental book. I think it'd be really hard to do as a group book. I think kids would get to like page 10 and say, what? So it's something that, you could do it as, put it on your shelf and tell kids about it. And, talk a little bit about the language and the time period before you give it to a student. I definitely think it's a book for our times. And you could actually do this if you were teaching a class, uh, creative writing class. You could show this as a post-apocalyptic book, that got genre. So I think there's lots of different ways you could approach this, or maybe use it, or simply just put on your shelf and let kids know that this is what this is about, the time. And then if kids are watching Last of Us, or Paradise, you can talk about how this was one of the first post-apocalyptic kinds of media. So this is I think, for now will be my final, dystopian post-apocalyptic book, unless I find another one that I really like. So thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time. Bye.